Here's what's coming up in episode 177. Jeff C. Carter returns.
Winter is the real scary time. Like, we as a species have evolved to survive winter. We didn't survive to evolve Halloween. Halloween is like, that's the party. And wintertime it's bleak. I could talk about Santa forever.
Yeah.
I think Santa Claus as an entity is so fascinating. Waiting in the Wings is this enormous back catalog of awesome Icelandic folklore creatures and giants and giantesses and ogres and pagan holidays and creepy saints. You know, Krampus is kind of the tip of the spear there.
Welcome to the Big Seance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the Seance.
Hi, friends. I truly hope everyone is staying safe and healthy so far this winter. My main gig, as you know, teaching in this cursed year of 2020, has been keeping me plenty busy and not leaving me with a lot of energy to spare when I get home. It's also a little scary, so my mind hasn't been here in the parlor much, but it does feel nice to get my Paranerd on tonight. Seriously though, please take care of yourselves and your families and stay safe and healthy. I want to tell you about a new favorite podcast of mine. It's the Fancy Free podcast hosted by Joanne Jarrett. One of her guests recently told a funny story that made me remember an embarrassing moment in my own life. And I thought, well, I don't know if Joanne ever shares listener feedback. And even if she doesn't, I'd like to reach out to her and let her know how much I've been enjoying the show and share my story. Well, she shared that story in her next episode. And then I ended up telling another story a few weeks later that she featured in her show as well. I am fairly confident that you all haven't heard these stories. Well, anyway, Joanne sent in a story for us here at the Big Seance. And I have to tell you, when you hear Joanne's story, you have to know how perfect it is that this happened to her, considering they love to share embarrassing stories on the Fancy Free podcast. It's hilarious, y'all. I don't need to give you any further setup here because she does a great job of doing that herself. Here's Joanne.
Hi, Patrick. This is Joanne Jarrett. As you know, you inspired a new segment of my show. And listeners, Patrick fans out there, if you haven't heard Patrick on my podcast, he is so good. Go to fancyfreepodcast.com/episode 68 or fancyfreepodcast.com/episode 75. Patrick shares his funniest, embarrassing stories. And the point of the Fancy Free podcast is to share our most embarrassing, funny stories so that we all feel less alone in our imperfections and forge connection through vulnerability and humor. Well, I was talking to my daughter the other day about this new listener story segment, and I said, I really wish I had a paranormal story so I could return the favor for Patrick's show, but I can't think of anything. And she reminded me of this thing that happened to us. So a little backstory on how I do laundry. I promise this is relevant. I used to fold everything meticulously, including my underwear. But when I was in my 20s and I started wearing thongs so that panty lines weren't a thing, I was like, you cannot fold these. So I would just wad them up and put them in my drawer. Well, ever since then, that's the way I put my underwear away. Totally saves time, just as easy to find them in the drawer. And who cares if your underwear is wrinkled? So that is the way I've been doing my underwear in the drawer for the last 25 years. The other day, well, it's been a few months now, I went into my drawer to grab my clean underwear for the day. And you guys, it was the craziest thing. My underwear were folded. There weren't very many in there because I was in a laundry quandary, as I often am, and I really needed to get to the laundry room and deal with that. But I hadn't yet. So there weren't that many underwear in the drawer. But the ones that were in there were folded and they were lined up in neat, tidy rows. I was like, okay, sometimes my kids will borrow my underwear because they get into laundry quandaries too. So my first thought was, okay, one of the girls, I guess, came in here and borrowed some underwear, but why on earth would they fold my underwear and line it up in rows when they don't fold anything or line anything up in rows in the rest of their lives? So I bet I asked him, I was like, hey, did either one of you borrow some underwear? I was just curious because my underwear drawer was in a condition that is so unfamiliar and it was just shocking. And I want to hear the story behind that. And they were both like, what are you talking about, Mom? Like, no. And for the most part, my underwear is way too big for them. So if they're borrowing my underwear, they're going to remember it. So you guys, I mean, it's just never been explained. We live way out in rural Montana. We keep our doors locked, even though we probably wouldn't have to. We're on a safe little country road where, knock on wood, nothing happens. And, I suppose we could have a neat and tidy laundry folding ghost, but I don't believe that is the case. And I should also mention the only other person who lives in our house is my husband. I don't even think he knows where I keep my underwear. We have separate closets and I am fully in charge of the laundry. Now, before you jump to conclusions, he does most of the cooking. I am better at the laundry and I don't want anyone else ruining the clothes. And I don't really like to cook, but I love to eat. So he does that. So I don't know, Patrick, I'm just curious, your thoughts, your hypotheses, your questions. I don't know. How do you think my underwear got folded up and lined up? Just as an announcement, if there is some kind of tidy, helpful force entering my closet and folding my underwear, it would be much more helpful if you would go to the laundry room. We keep the baskets full of clean clothes on top of the counter. You are so welcome to fold and categorize that.
Oh, Joanne, it's the perfect story for you to share with us. And I love that you were open to the possibilities of a ghost hanging in your home. And I truly hope you do have a ghost who loves to do laundry and is willing to help you out. I don't think that would be me, but I'm quite certain there are ghosts of all kinds. And maybe there's one who, has that passion. Right on. Well, as you would expect, Joanne, this reminds me of another story. And there's not much to it. But several years ago, my parents, who live about 3 hours from me, had a shower curtain ring go missing suddenly and randomly. And they couldn't find it. They looked everywhere and they kept calling me and giving me updates. And even though I would not put it past my dad to try to pull a trick like this on my mom, and I think probably part of my sister is thinking that it definitely was my dad. And it would be a weird choice for a trick, like really a random shower curtain ring. But I'm pretty sure he swears that this wasn't him even now. Well, the saga went on for weeks and supposedly it ended up in their bedroom, I think. Who knows? But, for a while, we talked about the shower curtain ring ghost. So thank you for your story, Joanne. And to my listeners, if you want to hear 2 embarrassing stories of mine that you haven't heard, visit the Fancy Free podcast and check out those 2 episodes that Joanne mentioned. All right. Well, before we pour the tea, I want to let you know that this episode might not be for little ones. You might just want to skip this episode until you are not with little ones, because we do a lot of talking about some holiday traditions. So if that's you, skip this episode for another time. All right. pouring the tea for our return conversation with Jeff C. Carter. Jeff C. Carter's stories have been featured in dozens of anthologies, translated for international markets, and adapted for podcasts. His love of science, adventure, and Halloween continue to inspire his science fiction, action, and horror writing. He lives in Southern California with a cat, a dog, and a human. He is a host of the Six Demon Bag podcast, and he was also right here on the Big Seance podcast in episode 173, just a little while ago, talking about his other new book, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 Fun-Sized Tales for Halloween. So if you missed that, go to bigseance.com/173. But his book that he's here to talk about today is another perfectly timed book, and that is the follow-up book, We Bleed Red and Green, 12 Chilling Tales for Christmas. And I want to read the description of that book. We Bleed Red and Green presents 12 chilling tales for the holidays from author Jeff C. Carter. Santa gets tough on the naughty list, a shut-in becomes addicted to a mysterious snow globe, and a poor inventor must forge his escape from a deadly curse. See how the Christmas spirit haunts playgrounds, dive bars, desperate thieves, and jungle explorers. If you have ever asked Santa for stories as black as coal that hook you like a candy cane, then you bleed red and green. So get it now. And you can find Jeff at jeffccarter.com. Welcome back, Jeff.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks for having me back into the parlor.
Absolutely. I love chatting with you. You're such a nice guy. And every time we have connected, we end up talking for like 20 minutes before we actually are reminded that we have to record an interview.
It's a good warm up. Maybe we should roll on those and we can have a little special bonus podcast.
We could. I know a lot of podcasters who do that. I should probably just take advantage of that and do that.
Called Too Much Information with Patrick and Jeff.
TMI. So have you gotten some good feedback from both of your We Bleed books? I'm just going to call them your We Bleed books.
Yeah, that's good. You know, it's funny. Amazon rolled out a new option, which is to create a series page. So if you have a bunch of books in a series, you can create a new sort of overarching page that will bring readers in and help them get started. And, I was trying to figure out what a good sort of catch-all name for the series would be. And like the We Bleed series or the We Bleed colors or We Bleed this and that. I don't know. If you have any ideas, let me know.
Are there any other follow-ups in the works?
I think there will be a follow-up Halloween book and a follow-up Christmas book. But, there's been a lot of jokes about me tackling other holidays. We Bleed blue and white for Hanukkah. We bleed red and pink for Valentine's Day.
We bleed gold and black for New Year's.
There you go. Although I like to submit New Year's under the overall Yule category.
Okay.
And so when you get into the older traditions, it's like everything from basically the end of Halloween until like mid-January was a really weird time for older cultures. The idea that like the sun was disappearing and coming back, they thought the veil between worlds was thin from basically Halloween until mid-January. And so, there's lots and lots of ghost stories for Christmas. And then there's all these like prophecies and things you can do around New Year's to try to divine the future. So it's a very strange, chilling time as far as folklore goes. So New Year's falls under that tradition for me.
Well, yeah, and there's just something spooky and scary about, and you mentioned something like this in your either the preface or the introduction to your book about, the solitude and darkness of winter and the short days and needing to curl under a blanket like I am today. There's just something that's automatically kind of creeptastic about that.
Well, Halloween is a spooky time, but it's also a time of largesse. It's harvest. And it's like, let's partake in the bounty of all the sunlight and all the toil we've had. And then winter is like, you're just counting your grains of corn and you're like, oh, I don't know if we're going to make it to the spring. Like winter is the real scary time. Like we as a species have evolved to survive winter. We didn't survive to evolve Halloween. Halloween is like, that's the party. And wintertime is the darkest, coldest, leanest time of year. It's when the animals starve to death and the crops wilt. It's bleak, but it's a great time for horror.
Well, yeah, and speaking of making it through in, this year, this wonderful grand year of 2020, we have this pandemic of literally trying to, and especially in many areas in the US, literally trying to just make it through winter, and we're just getting started, really. Does the pandemic or issues surrounding the pandemic, does it factor into your book at all, or are you pretending it's not a thing for the book to give people some a place to run away to?
I've been thinking about how to address the pandemic. Sometimes I write stories that are more historically based or period piece, and I've written some futuristic stories as well. But by and large, most of my stuff is present day or near future. So obviously the pandemic must be addressed. This book is sort of half and half. So half the stories were written before the pandemic and the other half were written during. And I just didn't see any reason to go there. I talked about it a little bit in the foreword to the book, but I think it will be unavoidable for future stories. At some point I'll write my pandemic story or my quarantine story, but at the same time, everyone is going to be writing pandemic stories and quarantine stories, and we're going to get quarantine podcasts and TV shows and web series and movies and horror books and romances. And it's like, I'm not sure I need to try to swim in that stream. I just don't know what it gains you other than verisimilitude or, a timestamp on when you wrote something.
Yeah. And I guess I think back to our last conversation on the Orange and Black book. It was kind of a gift to people in a time when we weren't sure how much Halloween we were going to get this year. And it was kind of a hideaway to have a way to have your Halloween. And so I can see how, there's a benefit of not having any pandemic world in your stories just to get away from it, because we're soaking in it right now.
Right. If anything, in my Halloween book, I addressed, themes of missing Halloween or having a less than perfect Halloween or trying to find a way to celebrate Halloween amidst bad circumstances. And this book, We Bleed Red and Green, is, more appropriately grim as befitting the winter time that we were talking about. So there's a lot of isolation. There's a lot of misanthropy and anxiety and grief in the book, but it's not like specifically name checking COVID-19 or anything like that.
Well, also in your last visit, one of my favorite conversations, because I can talk about nostalgia all day long, but we'd spent a lot of time talking about Halloween and the nostalgia and memories from school and growing up. And I can only imagine that your childhood played a big role in this book.
Yeah, Christmas is such a deeply personal holiday everyone celebrates it differently, even people in the same faith, even people that don't celebrate Christmas. Every house is different, every family is different. So whatever you're celebrating at the end of the year, the nostalgia hits hard. And unlike Halloween, where people may not typically gather with family, Christmas is sort of rooted in family for most people. So there's a lot of homesickness and longing. There's a lot of other emotions that come to the fore there. We always, went full out for Christmas. I was very, very fortunate. I was the Halloween head in the family, but the whole family came together for Christmas. And, we lived in a pretty woodsy, snowy place. We had a small hill in our backyard. So when it snowed, we could go sledding in my backyard. You just had to bail out before you crashed into these bushes or hit the trees at the bottom of the hill.
For us, it was a barbed wire fence at the bottom of the hill.
You just got to lean back or else you get a haircut. So, wintertime was always pretty epic. Even if it was just hiking out into the woods, finding a frozen pond and throwing rocks at it and trying to break the ice. Or, there was a small pond where we could go ice skating not far from my house. So I have a lot of really treasured memories from wintertime. How about yourself?
Well, I would say, and I found this one as we were talking about memories of Halloween and the fall, is that we clearly grew up in a similar type of area, and I have some of those same experiences in a giant hill with an acre backyard, and the barbed wire fence at the end of it. And we also had a pond nearby, and I love the fact that I grew up in the country, so that when it is dark, it really is dark, and there's just something cool about having those experiences. And I also remember you and I both talking about how our families made holidays special. They went out of their way to make things special. I was one of those giant nerds, and I'll have to do a disclaimer before our interview for the littles out there, but I fought through probably almost 6th grade still believing in the giant man in the red jacket, because they made it so special and so believable. And it was a huge, adjustment when, I was kind of a nerd. I was a little gullible, I guess. But, like my dad, there was one year where they tried to get me to believe so badly when I was getting older that Santa had come by, that they had like candy, and like the stuff that would typically go in a stocking was like trailing out the door. And then there was some trailing out the front door. And my dad had also found, there were a lot of wild dogs in the area, living out in the country. And there was this big pile of dog poo out in the front. And my dad was like, and look what Rudolph left you. And I'm like, oh my God, like that kind of thing.
That is beautiful.
Isn't that
what a Christmas
spectacular?
Miracle.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I do remember going, well, Dad, aren't they supposed to land on the roof? And he was like, well, I guess maybe they couldn't this year, or he had to make a pit stop or something. And I mean, that was magic for me.
Is that going in your book, Patrick? Seriously.
I might have to. I don't think it's in the book yet.
I could talk about Santa forever.
Yeah.
I think Santa Claus as an entity is so fascinating as a cultural ritual, as sort of a coming of age, right? For people that don't have a magical worldview, they use it as sort of an inoculation for kids, where it's like the first thing where they have them believe in something magical and engage in magical thinking. And then they break that spell. And forever from that point onward, and I can understand why parents fight so hard to make it last, because that's the day you stop believing in magic for most kids. Or you start to, it becomes analogous where people like, you don't believe in, Santa, do you? And that's like calling your critical thinking faculties into question.
It's an insult.
It's an insult. And it's like, it's like you don't wear diapers or, it's like some kind of small, we don't have a lot of rites of passage in our culture anymore, but that's one of them. And, it's interesting that you still are very open to the unseen and in the unexplained, even though you went through that rite of passage and it lasted a little longer. I don't know, maybe something baked in. On our podcast, The Six Demon Bag, we're all similarly fascinated by Santa. And my co-host Ed has a whole gaggle of children, and his daughter, they all believed in Santa well into maturity, because he would write them, they would write letters to Santa and he would write back these beautiful letters. And he would go, like your father, he would go out of his way to help them believe and to foster that Christmas spirit. And so he went on eBay and he bought an antique sleigh bell. This like big hunk of like iron from like Iceland. And he delivered it to them as like proof that Santa was real and the reindeer were real.
Stop it.
And as a result, he has this wonderful daughter who is enchanted with magic and fairies and all sorts of things. But, it did create friction inevitably between her and other girls her age, whose family wasn't quite so accommodating. And I don't know if you had a chance to read the book, but the first story name checks her as the character and with the mean girls.
I'm 2 stories into the book. I got to that one.
All right, good. There's some ghost stories, some proper ghost stories in this one. So I'm looking forward to you getting into that one.
Absolutely. I can't wait. Last time you were here, we also talked about the annoyance of Christmas creeping into Halloween's territory.
Yeah, that's right. The Christmas creep.
Yeah, you introduced us to a tasty metaphor. Do you remember that? Of fudge creeping all up into your salad. And,
yep.
Have you fully accepted the fact that the fudge is here and your salad is, maybe
forever chocolatey and tainted
or wilting and needing to be thrown away now? Like, how's the metaphor going now?
So I feel like there's 2 tracks. Pre-COVID, I feel like capitalism or market demands were creating this pressure to push Christmas earlier and earlier into the year, because most businesses make most of their money in the Christmas season. And Halloween is a growing industry. And so that is spreading further and further into the summer. Thanksgiving is just gone. Yeah. Like if it's like a crushed to a thin cranberry paste between these 2 expanding sectors of the market. But in my story about the werewolf going out on Halloween, in my Halloween book, he goes into a store on Halloween and it's all been switched over to Christmas. And like this sends him, is the first domino that tips him into his rage, because it's something I've always been frustrated with. And this year, I think it was like October 1st was the first time I went into a store and it was just all Christmas and all Christmas trees. Like they're like, all right, Halloween's not happening this year. Just pull it. Let's get these Christmas trees in here. So I don't like that fudge creeping into the salad. I do want to keep them separate. The other track is that with COVID, and now that time means nothing and that people need to fall back into some sense of nostalgia and comfort, there were people that put their Christmas stuff up in October, and I say more power to them. People have been listening to Christmas carols for months now. I started drinking eggnog early. I broke my December rule. I'm okay with it. We all just need to get through COVID-19. But as soon as it's in our rearview mirror, I will continue fighting the war on Christmas. I'm trying to push it back into December.
I do have to say at the same time, you're talking about at the beginning of October having the store with all Christmas. I was on a virtual Halloween roundtable type of thing, and I needed a costume. And so it was like the day before Halloween, and I went to Target to go see just what, if anything, I could get for a mask and it was like gone, like rated. Like the Christmas wasn't really out in full force, but everything was gone. Now, I don't know if that's because people hit Halloween harder than maybe stores thought they would, or if the stores just didn't plan on that. But it was like a day or two before Halloween, there was nothing there. And so I was like, wow.
I've heard similar reports basically across the country, and I think the word was out like Halloween is likely canceled for most people, and we've just got a big section of our store that we're not going to move anything, but it's never too early to sell Christmas stuff because Christmas is bigger than Halloween. So get this Halloween stuff out of here. We'll chuck it or warehouse it, and let's get these Christmas trees out. But yeah, Christmas creep is real, and it's extra real this year. I only hope that we haven't lost ground. Like, even when there's a vaccine available and things reopen, I hope they don't try to maintain their grip on October with all the Christmas merch
and make it a new tradition.
Yeah. But luckily, the chocolate and the peanut butter are mixing, and Christmas is mutating with creepy Halloweeny goodness.
I have seen that in the last several years. I can totally see the ghost stories coming back, stories by firelight.
Krampus is bigger than ever.
Yes.
And Waiting in the Wings is this enormous back catalog of awesome Icelandic folklore creatures and giants and giantesses and ogres and pagan holidays and creepy saints, weird traditions. Krampus is kind of the tip of the spear there. If you want to see how dark it gets in some of these Scandinavian and German countries, like, man, it's awesome. And I name check some of them in my book, but this is something that's sort of been a source of fascination for me for a really long time. So I'm excited. Like, go ahead, Christmas, bring it. Come closer to Halloween, and we will unleash these Icelandic winter horrors on you.
I want you to know in your second story, when Krampus replied with totes, I almost peed my pants. Just FYI.
Yeah, good. Krampus makes two appearances in the book. One sinister, one slightly less so. and then I move on. I actually have a story in a book that's sort of all about Krampus, and I've been in other holiday collections that, really lean hard on Krampus. So just like, I'm not going to be writing a lot of COVID stories. I'm probably not going to be writing a lot of Krampus stories, but I don't know if you ever talk about some of these spooky Christmas traditions like Befana, the Christmas witch.
No, actually, and even Krampus is still somewhat new to me.
Oh, okay. Just off the top of my head, there's Befana. She's a Christmas witch from Italy. She gives gifts, but she also beats children with her broom.
Oh, neat.
And sometimes they burn her in effigy. There's Frau Perchta. She is an evil hag from Germany. And if kids are naughty, she'll slit their bellies and stuff them with straw.
You mentioned some of these characters in that second story.
Yeah, and I just touched on a few of them. Hans Trapp I think he was a cannibal, but he hangs out with Santa now. He's part of his posse that takes care of naughty children. There's La Père Foutard, who would dress up like a scarecrow and hide in the woods and abduct children. He was like a serial killer. He now hangs out with Santa. There's Belsnickel, who's basically just a hobo, but sometimes he wears a dress. There's, of course, Krampus. Krampus abducts children and takes them away to be eaten or drowned or burned. And Krampus is this bestial, goat-like demon with horns and cloven hooves, and he's wrapped in iron chains. He's just like this terrifying demonic creature. And Santa takes care of the nice list, and Krampus takes care of the naughty list. And they have these like wild sort of bacchanalian traditions in parts of the world where winter is so severe. And they need like a little more cathartic release to get them through these long, dark months. But there is a festival December 5th called Krampusnacht. And it's where young men dress up like goat men, like these beast people, and they run through the crowds, whipping people with switches. And it's called a Krampus run. And sometimes they have these giant, elaborate costumes. Like imagine Carnival, but in Scandinavia. And, so they're just dressed in like these elaborate animal skins from head to toe with these like giant wooden monster masks and these heavy iron chains and big clanking cowbells. It's so awesome.
Have a holly jolly Christmas.
There is this Welsh tradition, so I won't be able to pronounce this correctly, but it's called the Mariluid. Have you seen this? It's a horse skull on a pole, and they drape like sheets from it, and they'll hide under it, and they will go up to people's door, and they will start singing and rhyming insults. And if you're inside and this the Mariluid comes to your door, you have to try. It's a call and response. And so you need to answer it with your own insults and rhymes. And it goes back and forth like a rap battle. And if you lose, the horse skeleton gets to come into your house and eat your food and drink your booze.
Stop it. And that currently goes on?
Yeah.
Or that was
they're bringing it back. They, a lot of these are much older traditions, but they are such tourist attractions that they're reviving some of these older traditions.
Oh my gosh.
Krampus was the first, but they're bringing these other things back. There is this one I just found about this year called the Basilisk, I think. And I think it's in Catalonia, but it's this giant, hairy Muppet monster. And they have like some men and some women who go up into the mountain and they bring down this giant hairy Muppet monster. Think like a Chinese dragon from a Chinese New Year festival with like the big clomping jaws. So this big goggle-eyed hairy Muppet comes down and it basically starts spilling, like telling everyone's dirty laundry. So it calls out like all the rumors and all the sins and all the bad behavior of people in the town. And just, it's like a social ritual where everyone is put on notice essentially for all the shit they did that year. And then they bribe it with food and booze. And then once the basilisk is happy, it goes back into the mountains for another year.
We as humans have really figured out a way to work out our stuff, haven't we?
In small villages, in small towns, you can have a group of people put on terrifying costumes, run through the streets, create havoc, or, there's certain, mummers plays and things where, saints, devils will battle in the streets so that the saints can ritualistically defeat evil for another year or banish them. And this happens in all sorts of cultures, but it's all kind of small groups. And sometimes not so small groups. Like in Mexico, you have some really wild street festivals. But if you have a community, you can create that kind of catharsis and release in that community. But when you live in a city, like, I'm in Los Angeles, I don't necessarily want a bunch of guys in goat masks running through the streets, smashing windows. That's just anarchy and chaos. It's not reinforcing any kind of social norm. But when you have really strong community, you can do things like the Lords of Misrule, was a much more ancient tradition where, they would take a person of low status and make them the person of high status. Or, in England, there's a day where the lords and ladies of the manor will wait on the servants. And on the one hand, this seems very egalitarian, like, oh, okay, we're all going to switch roles and the fool becomes the judge and the rich people become the servants. But it only works as a way of saying, okay, this is the exception to the rule. Every other day of the year, you are the servants and we are the masters. So, some of these traditions where you deliberately turn things upside down to defy the social order are just a way to ultimately reinforce the social order.
We learned so much from you. In your last visit, you taught us about this Japanese tradition, a dance. What was that called again?
Obanodori.
Yeah. That was really cool. People should check out that if they want to learn about that. But I mean, if anybody wants to know, how much research an author needs to do, I mean, oh my gosh, you have done so much of that.
It's just fascinating. I just, you fall down these wiki rabbit holes, or you go to a museum or a gallery and you see some wild cultural tradition. And it's like, I want to know more about that. And just different ways to be human.
Yeah.
There's so much similarity across the world. But then there are these like little weird nuggets that you're like, how did they come up with? There's another thing called the Caganer, and it's also in Spain. I think it's in the Basque region or it's in Catalonia, but it's the Christmas pooper. So they have this like little ceramic or wooden figure that they'll tuck into nativity scenes. And it's just a little elfin guy taking a dump. And it's part of their Christmas tradition. And then there's, I think this is going to take off soon. It's called Kagatillo. He's Uncle Pooper. It's the Christmas log. And so it's like it's a log with two little peg feet and like a smiley face. And he has like a hollow space in his back with a blanket over him. And all month long, if the kids are good, the parents will put candy and treats into the log. And then on Christmas Day, the kids will beat the log with a stick to make him poop out treats. And there is a song that goes along with it that I'm not going to sing because it's in Spanish, but it's basically poop log, give us our treats. And it's like, wow, export that to the United States, please. We need Kagatillo.
It's like a poop yada.
It's exactly a poop yada. TM, trademark, big seance.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, Caganer and Kagatillo are probably two of the strangest things I've come across in my research.
I would say so. And in a nativity scene?
I think that's where the Caganer goes. Yeah.
Wow. Do you have scary memories of Christmas from your childhood?
Christmas, no. Winter, yes.
Yeah.
And, I was going to ask you when we were talking about ice skating and just hanging out in nature, have you ever had frostbite?
I haven't had frostbite. I probably felt like I had frostbite, but I can only assume you would know if you had frostbite.
Yeah, you would know. It's man. There were times as much, I love the freedom we had to run around in the woods, but there were times when we did get lost or we would just be out for hours in the freezing cold. And, we kind of understood wind chill factor, or we'd be running around in scarves and gloves and sweating. And then the sun goes down and you're like, all right, well, it's a 2-hour hike back home. And now you're wet and cold. Yep. And there were some times where I did get some mild frostbite and just had to sit with my feet in a bucket of warm water and just like suffer. Like there's nothing you can do. I don't know. Maybe nowadays they have some drugs that, knock you out or something, but like you just have to wait for your feet to thaw. And it is so brutal.
But you kept all your appendages though.
Yeah, nothing turned black and sloughed off.
Yeah.
Just like red and just incredibly agonizingly painful. And I wish I could say I was younger and should have known better, but I'm pretty sure I was a teenager both times I got mild frostbite. And there was one time a sibling who shall remain nameless, but I was a young snot-nosed little kid, and we went down this huge hill next to our neighborhood and up this hill to this pond, and it was the skate pond. And looking back now, I mean, this pond was probably the size of my front yard now. I mean, it's just a teeny tiny pond, but when it froze over, we'd bring our ice skates, and we all had these, janky hand-me-down ice skates. And, I don't know, when was the last time you laced up a pair of skates, but they have like 100 yards of shoelace goes into each one. And I remember I was a very young kid, single digits, right? So 6, 7, 8 or something, I'm not sure. And I had gone to the pond to skate with one of my siblings who shall remain nameless. And at a certain point, it was getting dark and they wanted to go home, but my laces had gotten wet and like swollen up. And so I couldn't take off my skates. But when you're wearing skates, you can't climb this giant snowy hill to get home. And so I managed to get one of them off, and I just couldn't, my fingers were frozen and like numb, and my shoelaces were wet and swollen shut. And like, I probably knotted them in the worst possible way.
Right.
And so my sibling was just like, all right, well, just stay here then, figure it out. I'm going home. And so they put on their boots and hiked up the hill to go home. And so I remember limping up this huge snowy hill with one ice skate on, convinced I would never get home, and just like crying, snot running down my face, freezing to me. And eventually someone in my family realized I never came home and like came and got me. That was scary. That was bad.
Oh my gosh. We never went too far from home in the winter in those situations. My memories of that is that my dad it was also horrifying. It was kind of scary looking, but a enormous wood stove that my grandfather, his dad had welded together out of pieces of oil drums. Like, I mean, this thing is never moving out of that house. It's just there forever. And for many years, my extended family would kind of poke fun at my sister and my little sister, because when we would come over, we smelled like, they called us, I forget what they called us, little chimney sweeps or something, because we always smelled like smoke. But our house was always so warm. And in the winter, for those years that we used it, well, we would take breaks from sledding or from being out. We'd go in, I don't know, 2 or 3 times in a day, and you'd take all your stuff off and we'd lay them on the top, and I can still hear that that it would do. And within like 2 minutes, it was dry. It was warm. You put it back on and we went back out. It was nice.
You are so lucky. I remember the first shift of sledding. You're warm and cozy and everything's fine. And then you're soaked through, you come in, you have PB&J, maybe some potato chips and a Coke. And then it's time for the second shift. The sun is a little lower in the sky. Wind chill has risen. And then you're pulling on those wet,
grossness,
sticky, pulling on wet mittens and wet ski clothes. Yeah. The second shift was always brutal.
Yeah.
But you had to do, what are you going to do? Not sled?
Right. Because tomorrow might not be a snow day. You have to take advantage of it now.
That's right.
I also remember snow ice cream. If you could find, a patch of snow that wasn't yellow, snow ice cream was awesome. Did you have that practice?
If you had some really fresh snow, like perfect snowball snow, you could roll it up and you would see the grass underneath, and the snow ice cream would kind of taste like grass. It was like good. It had like a nice, light, citrusy, earthy taste to it, but
a little vegan flair to it.
Yeah, I probably ate my body weight in snow many times, which if you're ever in a survival situation, you're not supposed to eat snow or drink snow melt because you're dropping your core temperature further, which is making you more likely to succumb to hypothermia and die of exposure. You got to boil that water, folks.
Good to know. What do you want us to know about this follow-up book of yours that we haven't talked about?
So it's probably important to know up front that this book is not as kid-friendly. Or it's just kind of plain not kid-friendly.
Yeah.
This one's more of a horror book. It deals with more serious and grim themes. There's some humor and there are some playful stories and elements, but nothing quite so saccharine as some of the joys and thrills of my Halloween book. I had a list of 10 like PG-rated kid-friendly stories in my Halloween book, but with 12 chilling tales, they're all calculated to deliver for adults.
You got real this time.
Winter gets real. I felt it. You felt it. Christmas horror or holiday horror, year-end horror, whatever you want to call it. It's less about, that spooky person was just my neighbor in a mask. It's all tricks and treats. It really is. If you want to look at Charles Dickens, there's a lot of haves and have-nots. There's a lot of incredible poverty, that Dickens wrote about, supernatural judgment, damnation. And that's just like in our beloved Charles Dickens, Christmas Carol. And then you look at other traditions and, winter was a time of intense struggle. So I have a story about a guy who's robbing a house on Christmas because he wants his kids to have gifts that year. And, it kind of leans into some of those themes of scarcity, of poverty, of desperation. And, some of the best ghost stories have to deal with memory and trauma. So you're going to find a lot of grief and guilt in these stories as well. But there's some laughs in there if you have a dark sense of humor.
My husband and I were watching Home Alone for the first time in, years. I used to watch, I could still say all the lines as it was going by, but it's been years since I've watched it. And I'd forgotten how creepy the storyline. First of all, getting left at home by yourself. That's a frightening Christmas collaboration right there. But the neighbor who had the garbage can, who was salting, the sidewalks, and then, the kids were watching him talking about how he kills his victims and keeps his victims in his garbage can with the salt because the salt dissolves the bodies or whatever it was. And I was just like, that's a creepy good tale right there. That could be its own, its own story.
It is funny to look back at certain older media with a modern lens, and you're like, oh, it's a bunch of grown men doing a home invasion on a child, and he's trying to kill them? Like, awesome.
And that was an awesome family movie.
Yep. There's a lot of family entertainment that it's only a matter of time until there are trigger warnings in front of everything we watched in the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Yep. So besides going to jeffccarter.com, where can people find you? And is there anything else coming up you want to talk about?
I would, hope people would check out some of my other short story collections. There's We Bleed Orange and Black for Halloween that we discussed. There's another one called Between the Teeth that preceded that one. That's not themed, but it's a nice cross section of my fiction over the years. And I am working on another spooky story. I'm looking at a novella or novel coming up next.
Nice.
And I would love to tell you about it, but I have learned over the years that the quickest way to get the dopamine hit of telling a story is to just tell someone the idea. So I need to keep that cooking.
Well, Jeff, you rock so much. Thank you again for coming into the parlor this spooky winter.
Thank you for having me. I'll raise a cup of eggnog as soon as I'm able to put a little booze in there. And I hope you have me back to talk about the next project.
Thank you to the following super Paranerds who support the show at patreon.com/Big Seance. Stephanie Moss, James Deacon, Melissa Armour, Anne Marie Sullivan, Justin J. Justin, Genesis, Natalie, Kim Robb, Jim Budd, Josiel Lorenzo, Susan Davey, Paula Mitchell, and Amy Park Gedicke. My supporters at the Parlor guest level, who can be found at bigseance.com/parlorguests, are Linda of shimmeringmoons.com, Denise Sia of Mystic Moms Paranormal, Ann Rekovich of ozparatech.com, Jillian Martin, Mindy Kentop, Hope Battaglia, Cassie Keller, Glenna Becker, Diane Rax, Nettie, Dina DeCastro of Dina DeCastro Astrology, Peggy Hagen, Marion Hover Clairvoyant, Bruce Williams, Lana and John of Carbon Lilies, David Rubenstein, and Norman and Linda Keller. That sound that you just heard was the above and beyond. There's not even a category for your level of support fireworks display, because I have 4 awesome listeners who continue to support the show at the $10 level. Steve Skinner, Kevin Gilbert, AJ Meredith, and James Wilfong. So thank you, Steve, Kevin, AJ, and James. And thank you, Paranerds.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. You can find and subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and just about anywhere podcasts are found. Do you have any comments or feedback? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how to get your voice in a future show. Or you can call my feedback line, 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. Interested in learning how to promote and share the podcast? Go to bigseance.com/share. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.